Hi everyone, it is Jen from Fiber Me This, and today I want to show you how to do the bind off for the Cape May Crescent Shawl. So here we have a representation of your last section, which is section 10, and you want to make sure that no matter where you end section 10, whether you do more or less, that your last row, when you knit back, you do all knits instead of purls, because that's going to help our bind off not roll forward. So the bind off is a combination of a Russian bind off, which is very stretchy. So if you do not use this bind off, you want to make sure that you do use a stretchy bind off so that when you block your shawl into that crescent shape, you have some ease and stretch across the crescent arc on top. So we're going to use a Russian bind off, and then we're going to put in some really baby mini picots, and it just gives it a really nice sweet little accent around the outer edging. And before we start, I want to show you where those picots are going to go. So if you look at our work here, and when you first start your bind off on your shawl, you're going to have several stitches, I believe it's 5 or 6, that you're going to do the Russian bind off. And then when you get to this right here, which is your previous yarn over, and you can see them as you go down the row, you're going to do your picot in the stitch that is just to the right of that yarn over. So you have your yarn over here, the stitch that goes with that yarn over that you knit when you came back, and then the stitch right next to that will take your picot. And then we're going to skip the next yarn over, so you're not going to do a picot on that one, and do a picot every other yarn over in the stitch right before the yarn over. I think I said in the yarn over, I didn't mean that, but you're going to do a picot every other yarn over, and you're going to use those yarn overs to help you keep track of that. So let's get started. Let me show you how you do the Russian bind off. And the first 2 stitches are a setup. So we're going to knit the first stitch. We're going to knit the second stitch. And then you're going to take your your left hand needle, and put it in the front of those 2 stitches, and then you're going to knit them together through the back loop. And when I do that, I actually hang on to those stitches with my thumb, grab my yarn from the back, and pull it through. I am a continental knitter, but you would do this the same if you're an English knitter. Now, okay, so that was our setup, our first little Russian bind off setup. Now we're going to just knit the next stitch, put the left needle in through the front, and knit those 2 stitches together through the back loop. I'll do that again. Knit that stitch. We have 2 stitches on our right hand needle. Put the left hand needle in through the front and knit them through the back. Now we are to the first stitch that we are going to do our picot in, and it is the stitch to the right, just to the right of your previous yarn over. And to do the little picot, you are going to knit into that stitch while leaving this stitch on the needle. So this stitch is going to stay on the needle. We are going to knit into that and place that knit stitch back on the needle. We are going to knit into it again and also place that stitch on the needle. And you want to make sure not to make this second stitch too tight. It can get a little tricky to get into if it's too tight. And then I took the stitch that was on my right hand needle and placed that back as well. So we have 4 stitches now. We have our original stitch, we have 1 new stitch, a second new stitch, and the stitch from our right hand needle. Now we are going to just knit that first stitch there, we are going to knit the second stitch, and that's the one that can be a little tight because it's twisted. And then you're going to pass the first stitch over the second. And we're going to do that one more time. Knit the next stitch, pass the first stitch over the second. And that's it. At this point, we're going back to our Russian bind off. This was our original stitch here that we had made our increased stitches through, but that one we are going to just knit and then do our Russian bind off, where we put the left hand needle in the front and pull it through the back. And there's our first baby little picot, which we'll be able to see better as we do a few more here. And now I am going to go back to the Russian bind off, knitting a stitch and then knitting two together through the back loop. We are going to pass the next eyelet because we're spreading the picots out. You can obviously do any type of picot you like. You can spread them or make them as close together as you like. But I really liked the way this looked in the final blocking. So now I am not doing a picot at the next eyelet. Just continuing with my Russian bind off. And now I have skipped an eyelet, but I'm to the next one. And so in this stitch that is just to the right of that eyelet, I am going to do another picot. So we're going to keep that stitch on the needle, knit it, and place the new knit on the needle. Go into that original stitch, put that stitch on the needle, put our right hand stitch on the left needle. Then you're going to knit that stitch, knit the second stitch, and pass the first over the second, knit the next stitch, pass the first over the second, and now we are back to our Russian bind off. This was our original stitch that we made the two new stitches into, and we are going to knit those two together through the back loop and continue on. The next stitch is then the eyelet because we made the picot in one stitch prior to the eyelet. Just continue on with our Russian bind off. Let me do a few more Russians here and then I'll show you what it looks like. When you're done, you might want to, or you might need to go back and organize your picots a little bit. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Oops, I split my yarn, Jennifer. Un momento. There we go. Okay, let's just pull that. So, and you get these sweet little picots. And then sometimes I go back and just organize them a little bit if they have somebody who's sticking out really far. But you can see how nice and stretchy this bind off is. And the blocking video will help show you how to block this. But after I put the wire in the top crescent, I went through, you know, so my wire was like this. I went through and made sure I pulled out all my little picots so they just subtly stick out the edge of the shawl. And knitting the row back, the row before, helps prevent this from rolling. And while it is rolling just a little bit now, once you block it, it will lay nice and flat. I hope that helps. Good luck.